Evening. So, going to have to put up with me standing behind the lectern here a little bit because the battery's run out of my remote. Anybody has an Apple remote in the audience? I'll happily use it. Thanks for the introduction. As Matt said, I've been around the data industry for like well over a decade now, kind of like touring through some of the, what I would call big data companies before it was even really called big data. It was just data. There was just lots of it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of the industry, state of the market. Just prior to founding Continnuuity, I was at Battery Ventures as an EIR and really focused on the investment thesis and strategy around investing in big data and also infrastructure. And, kind of like developed a model. Out of that obviously came Continnuuity. But there's a bunch of other stuff as well where, we've kind of like made investments or, looked for companies. Obviously created Continnuuity in one space, but there's a bunch of other things as well. Come on in. It's okay. My buddy's at the back there.
Go to the back if you can. There's plenty of seats.
So, where do we start, right? When I think about, where are we at in IT? For this decade, cloud and big data are the two mega trends, for sure. And we're not going to talk about cloud, but, realistically, all that does is put a fabric layer. And below that, there's a bunch of really interesting stuff that goes on. Above that, I think the most interesting things are going to be data applications, specifically big data applications over the next 10 years. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So why big data? Psych, I'm not going to talk about why big data. Big data's here. Right, you all know it. That's why you're sitting here, listening to this, right? And what I'm going to tell you is it's not a silver bullet. We really have to think about it, right? What I'm going to talk about is the market, right, and where I think that is. And to get there, we need a little kind of history lesson, I think. So, if you'll indulge me a little bit. I think of the database, the original RDBMS, as the first data fabric. And it wasn't called that back in the day. It was just called a database. But, before the RDBMS standardized and before SQL came along, everybody had their own custom data store with their own language, before SQL, and people were doing data applications, but they were like their own little silos. And then the RDBMS came along, the database came along, and SQL as a language came along and said, okay, we have a standardized platform now. Mostly, everybody's SQL is a little bit different. But from that enabled the next 30 years of innovation in the BI and analytics space to really grow on top of that platform. And over that time, we saw a bunch of tools emerge, a bunch of archetypal applications, like CRM or Salesforce automation, supply chain management. These archetypal app patterns that apply across multiple industries. And we haven't got to that point yet in the big data space. And so, one way that, I like to kind of like form my thesis about where the market's going to go is to look back and, take cues from that. And this has created, pretty big, industry, right? Right now it's kind of like $30-40 billion as an industry. It's not humongous, right? It's not Facebook on its own, right? But it's still a pretty big industry, and lots of people have made some pretty decent, money out of it and created a whole bunch of value. And I actually think that, the more and more focus that, we're seeing, the more focus that we're seeing on big data is really an insight into the fact that data is now becoming, the lifeblood of your organization. It is a competitive advantage. It's no longer infrastructure. It's no longer tools. It's not necessarily, just your people. It's what people do with that data. Data is how people drive their businesses right now. But, of course, the database had problems, right? And so, we saw this big data market appear, and the problems were like scalability, being able to deal with different schemas, how long it takes to actually implement projects, right? So when we look at the big data market itself and think, it's actually still pretty immature as well. We're really only a couple of years in, maybe 2 years into the formation of what I call a real market. Big data itself started, really probably, kind of like 5-6 years ago with Google talking about the MapReduce paper and then, Yahoo implementing that and creating Hadoop. And in many ways, Hadoop, you could look at Hadoop and say that really created the whole big data market and big data movement. Up until that point, the general populace didn't have the platform or the technology to be able to actually scan and process all of this data, all right? And so they looked at it and went, wow, we're going to spend millions of dollars with companies like Greenplum or EMC or Teradata. No, screw that. We'll just throw that data on the floor. There's not a lot of value there. Now they're finding that actually there is value in this data, and they have a platform that they think they can use to process that data. But as it turns out, that platform is still pretty immature. And so we're just, I think, going through this kind of like phase shift in the big data market expansion where we went from the pioneers like Yahoo or Facebook or LinkedIn, people in the valley in and around where I work who create this stuff and invent it because it just doesn't exist. And then the fast followers like a Bank of America or Goldman or, those type of companies, eBay, who will take that and can still put 15, 20 people on it. And that's reasonable. The fast followers who are coming along don't want that experience. They can't afford to put 20 people on just to stand up Hadoop and make it work. They actually want to get real value and insight out of that platform, right? So you see a whole bunch of companies trying to help with Hadoop, making it simple. Okay, my buddy there is doing exactly that, more to data, right? It's putting a layer over top of a crappy infrastructure, really nice infrastructure that's hard to use, sorry, and making it a lot more simple. But this market's going to take a while to unfold. I'm guessing it's going to take, maybe 15 years to get to the point in this market where we're at in traditional BI, and that's twice as fast as it went in traditional space. And we've seen some of the plays, so we know which way it's going. But right now, the fast followers want a completely different experience to what they're getting in the market. Now, another way to look at the market, not along a timeline per se, is really a kind of like layered view. And at the bottom, there's this infrastructure and plumbing. And this is really where you see all of these things like Hadoop and Mongo and React and Redis and a whole bunch of infrastructure bits that fit down there. They're hard to use, they're open source, you have to assemble them yourselves. There's companies like Cloudera and Hortonworks trying to take and package those things together. But the general experience is, I like to think of it like the homebrew computing club 30 years ago, where you got a bit of memory here and a motherboard there and a chassis here and maybe some tape drive there. And you wired it together and went, look, I have a computer. Right? And then along came Steve Jobs and said, no, sod that, we're just going to give you the whole thing. And it just worked. Right? That's actually where we need to get to. Right? So above the infrastructure, there's a whole bunch of development and management tools. That's developing big data applications, being able to develop analytics, be able to manage the infrastructure that's out there. And sitting on top of that is the analytic applications. It's a pretty simplistic view of the market, but it actually has held true for the last couple of years. And when I was at Teradata, I used to run the strategic long-range planning group, and we used similar model to actually figure what's our strategy for the next 10 years. We're a company leading the data warehousing space. We've been around for 30 years. No one could really touch us, but we realized that there was this big sea change happening, and we needed to figure out where we're going to go and what we're going to do about it. The analytic applications are actually, I think, where all the value gets created, right? It's actually the apps at the top, that people really care about. That's why, MySQL did pretty well, but, they didn't do quite as well as Oracle or PeopleSoft, right? And so ultimately, value accrues over time at the top. Now, when you think about it from an entrepreneur standpoint, like myself or these other guys sitting up here, where's their opportunity in the purely big data space? Right now, the infrastructure plumbing layer is saturated. There's absolutely no point, in my opinion, in coming out with a new storage engine and sticking it into the infrastructure place. There's going to be a bunch of consolidation that happens there. But there is more interesting stuff to be done in the development tools layer and also the analytic application layer above. Right? So where are we today? Barely out of the infrastructure piece. Right now, like I said, it's still super raw. To use that stuff. We're barely out there. People are starting to do bits and bobs above the infrastructure. So what's missing? Right, given that I've just kind of like painted this picture of we just have infrastructure and there's a bunch of stuff at the bottom, what is actually missing in this space? Well, the first thing is applications. Right now, if you're actually a consumer and you're like, hey, or a company, you're like, I have a big data problem. And okay, where are the apps I'm going to buy? Is there like a PeopleSoft? Is there like a CRM system? Is there Salesforce automation? What are those apps? They don't exist yet. And there's a bazillion startups out there, and I saw them when I was at Battery, all coming by pitching us, trying to raise money, who have an idea for a big data application. It's not clear what those applications are going to be, or what ones are going to win, what the archetypal patterns are going to be. But one of the patterns that's emerging is an application pattern I call consumer intelligence. This is the type of pattern where you're taking signals from consumers, whether that's their Foursquare check-ins or whether that's the digital exhaust that they're leaving out on the web, whether that's their behavioral data they're doing on your website. There's a class of these applications starting to appear where people take signals, use that to personalize experiences, and then deliver those experiences back much better to the end consumer. There's more applications still starting to appear in big data, but this has been the kind of like the prevalent pattern right now. Do I think in 20 years' time this is going to be the archetypal pattern for big data? I don't know, which is why I didn't start a company building an application. Right? But there's a bunch of people that I saw come by who have. Right? And we see this a lot. At Yahoo, we used to ingest 100 billion events a day and use that to actually personalize the experiences for everybody who came across our 800 different web properties. There's a huge amount of data that we were able to use to personalize the experience and use that for ad targeting, content targeting, and all the rest of it. But you can't build compelling experiences if you're dealing with old, stale, out-of-date data. And so that, so far, big data has really been a very much kind of like batch-driven, process something once a night or process something, once an hour, whatever it is. And that's, that's a problem when it comes to a consumer. Like you can't walk into, a mall or a Starbucks and check in and get a coupon for a Starbucks coffee an hour later when you've actually got home. You want it right then, right now, right? And so this is one of the challenges that the big data applications guys are focusing. And so where does that lead us? That leads us to being able to do real-time data and be able to do real-time processing of big data. Traditionally something that hasn't existed, and Hadoop doesn't really support that. And I keep referring to Hadoop because it's by far the largest 800-pound elephant, we'll call it, not the gorilla, the elephant in the room when it comes to big data processing. There's a bunch of other infrastructure pieces around there. Some doing well, Mongo, some doing not so well. But Hadoop really is kind of like the prevalent force, and so there's an entire industry and market forming around it. So you think about the consumer experience and what you want to do, that really leads into the real-time web. I think we're all starting to see that the experiences we get on our tablets, on our phones, on the web is changing dramatically from where it was 10 years ago. Right? You're actually, instead of doing a refresh in your browser, things just happen, right? And actually you get pushed events, you get push notifications right to your phones. And you all know that the proliferation of these mobile devices is going to take over the world, right? So everybody's going to have a mobile device, and very few people are going to have computers. Once you get to that, the real-time web experience really requires you to be able to crunch that data behind. So there's opportunities there to be able to do that at large scale. But like I said, who cares if you can't act in real time? Hadoop is not real time, right? It's actually a batch platform. And at the same time, so let's say you can just do it, you can take that data in, you can process it in real time, you can build applications. As a developer, your life sucks out there. Right? I don't know if there's any developers in the room who have been trying to use this technology, but right now it's really tough. It's really hard, right? There's a few kind of like bearded, sandaled, hairy guys who like it, who used to be like IT system administrators and Unix system administrators, but anybody out there like that? The general populace, doesn't want tools like that, right? Those tools are for Asperger's people, right? We actually want we actually want other tools, right? And so this is what it feels like right now. You kind of you take some of these blocks and you cobble it together, and you end up with this kind of nasty, redneck architecture, as I like to call it, right? But what people really want is a much more Zen-like, nicely packaged working experience. Right? And this is actually where, as an industry, we need to get to. Right? And there's a few companies focusing on it, but this will be what actually enables that huge raft of analytic applications to be created and be delivered. Or actually, that's where the value is, and that's what businesses want. They don't want to have to build infrastructure and all the rest of it just to get to the analytic application. As an industry and a market, we need to fill in those gaps so people actually want to use data. Right? So, I only got 10 minutes, so we'll quickly summarize. I think that big data is changing the world of analytics. It's actually changing the way we think about data, the way we process it, the type of applications that we're building, and actually massively, I didn't really talk about this, but massively changing the mindset. The traditional BI world was very much schema at write time. So you had to know how you wanted to store that data in particular schema when you wrote it down. Big data, the fundamental shift is thinking about schema at read time, which is I just plow my data into some platform. I don't know how I'm going to query it. I don't know what the schema is. But when I read it, that's when I want to know. That's when I start to form the schema around it. That's the fundamental shift, and that's a very, very big shift. I've been in this decade, in this thing for a decade. There's a bunch of folks I know from my older companies who are like, "What are you talking about? You have to know the schema up front. How do you do query planning or any of that stuff?" They're not going to get it. There's a bunch of people who are going to get it, and this is the big shift, right? The market is very immature at the minute, and it's going to evolve over the next 5 to 7 years. I think we're going to see a bunch more applications, but we need to fill in the gaps before people can actually successfully build apps, right? And they're going to build applications that actually deliver much more value over time, right? And do that at a massive scale. So I didn't talk too much about continuity because we're on stealth mode, but you may have got a few little clues of things that we're thinking about here. We're actually focused on enabling that next wave of big data application development. If you're interested, come and follow us at Continnuuity.com. Thank you.
Thank you.